The autumn rain fell heavy against the streets of Boston, washing away the dust of 7 years in thin, grey rivulets. Margaret stood at the window of the Ashworth estate, her gloved fingers tracing the condensation on the glass as she watched the world blur beyond it. The parlour behind her was immaculate, Persian rugs, mahogany furniture, everything arranged with the precise elegance expected of a woman of her station. Yet nothing here felt like home. She had received his letter 3 weeks ago. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with the ducal crest of Harrington, a crest she had once traced with trembling fingers during stolen moments in darkened halls. Her hands had shaken so violently that her lady's maid, Constance, had nearly dropped the breakfast tray. Edward was returning to Boston. After 7 years of silence, after he had left for London promising letters that never came, after she had made a life without him, he was coming back. Margaret turned from the window, her sapphire dress whispering against the polished floors. At 31 years old, she carried herself with the composed grace of a woman who had learned to live on her own terms. Her dark hair, pinned in an elegant arrangement, showed the first threads of silver, marks of a life lived in contemplation rather than frivolity. The bloom of youth had faded, replaced by something deeper, the quiet beauty of a woman who had survived heartbreak. The knock at the door came precisely at 3 o'clock. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still. Constance entered first, her expression carefully neutral. "The Duke of Harrington has arrived, madam. He awaits you in the receiving room." 7 years. 7 years of letters never written, of social engagements attended with a carefully constructed smile, of watching younger women find happiness while she remained suspended in the amber of a memory. She had convinced herself she no longer loved him, that love, like autumn leaves, had simply fallen away and decayed into nothing. But as she walked toward the receiving room, her heart betrayed her. It raced like it had when she was 24 years old and terrified of the world, yet brave enough to love him anyway. The door opened, and Edward stood by the fireplace. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply forgotten the way he filled a room with his presence. His shoulders were broader, his face more angular, marked by lines that suggested he had weathered his own storms. His dark hair bore the same subtle wave she recalled, though now threaded with silver at the temples. When he turned to face her, his eyes, that particular shade of grey-blue that had once captured her soul, widened slightly, and for a moment he looked as uncertain as she felt. "Margaret," he said, and the simple utterance of her name carried 7 years of unspoken words. "You look beautiful, more beautiful than I remembered." She had rehearsed 100 proper greetings, 100 ways to maintain the distance that 7 years and heartbreak should have secured. But as she took in the sight of him, she found her carefully constructed defenses crumbling like old mortar. "Edward," she replied, her voice steady despite the tempest within her. "I was not entirely certain you would come." He smiled, that same smile that had once made her believe in fairy tales. "Neither was I. I've thought of little else for months, but seeing you, I realized that no amount of thinking could have prepared me for this." Margaret gestured to the settee, and they sat in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch like pulled taffy. Outside, the rain continued its relentless fall. Inside, 2 people who had once been everything to each other struggled to recognize the strangers they had become. In her memories, Edward had always been the golden boy, the second son of the Earl of Harrington, blessed with charm, intelligence, and a fortune that made him enviable to every family seeking advantageous matches. Margaret, the daughter of a respected Boston merchant, had caught his eye at a winter ball in 1865. He had sought her out night after night, defying the expectations of his family, which viewed Americans with mild disdain and marriage alliances with careful calculation. Their love had been the sort that consumed everything in its path. Stolen moments in conservatories, letters written in trembling script and hidden beneath floorboards, the promise that together they could forge their own path, regardless of what either side of the Atlantic expected. Edward had spoken of marriage, of a life where titles and expectations mattered less than the beating of two hearts synchronized in devotion. But then his father had fallen ill. The letters changed in tone. His family needed him. His duties were calling. There was an arrangement that had been made years prior, he wrote, a union with an English noble family that would secure the Harrington name and fortune. He had tried to refuse, but in the end, the weight of legacy had proven heavier than the fragile bridge of their love. Margaret had not wept when he departed. She had been, instead, a study in composure. She had attended social events, smiled at the appropriate moments, and gradually accepted that the fairy tale was over. At 24, she had believed that love conquered all. At 31, she knew better. Life was a series of compromises, and love was the privilege of those who could afford to defy convention. But now, 7 years later, she learned that Edward's marriage had been, by all accounts, a bitter disappointment. His wife had been cold, ambitious, and more interested in his title than his heart. They had separated quietly, as such things were done among the aristocracy. Divorce was impossible, but distance was easily arranged. She had heard this through whispers at society events, through the careful conveyance of information that travelled along the tea-table gossip chains. And now he was here, and he was looking at her like she was the only real thing he had encountered in years. "I have thought of you every day," Edward said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them like snow. "Every single day, Margaret. When my marriage began to deteriorate, when I realized what I had sacrificed, your face was the only thing that offered me comfort." Margaret rose from her seat and walked to the window, needing distance between them. "Edward, you cannot come here after 7 years and speak to me as though time has not passed. We are not the same people we were." "Are we not?" His voice was close behind her now. "I feel precisely the same when I look at you, perhaps more so, because now I understand what I lost." "You lost nothing," Margaret said, her voice sharp with the defense mechanism she had cultivated over years of loneliness. "You chose your duty, you chose your family, and I chose to survive." Edward's reflection appeared in the glass beside her own. "I made a terrible mistake." Over the following weeks, Edward became a fixture in Margaret's life. He would call in the afternoons, bringing books and flowers. They would walk through the Boston Common, talking about art and philosophy and the lives they had built in his absence. Margaret learned that he had become a patron of the arts, funding orphanages and libraries with the same passion she remembered him bringing to their youthful dreams. He had become, in many ways, the man he had always promised to be, just not the man she had imagined at her side. There were moments when the past felt less like a bridge that had burned and more like a rope that had merely been left tangled. When Edward spoke of bringing her to London, of introducing her to his circle, Margaret found herself tempted. She was a woman of means, comfortable and respected in Boston society. Moving across the Atlantic to become the companion of a separated duke would create scandal. It would invite questions about her character, her judgment, her virtue. But there were also moments when his hand brushed hers, and she felt the ghost of who they had been together. The girl who had believed love was enough, and the man who had once been willing to defy the world for her. They flickered in and out of visibility like gaslight in the fog. Her friend Catherine came to call one grey afternoon in November. Catherine had been her closest confidant through all the years of Edward's absence, the one person who had never questioned Margaret's quiet devotion to a memory. She settled into the parlour with the air of someone about to deliver either devastating news or unwanted advice. "Everyone is talking," Catherine said without preamble. "About Edward, about the attention he pays you, about what it means." Margaret set down her tea with deliberate care. "Let them talk." "It is not so simple," Catherine replied. "He is a married man, Margaret, however separated he may be, and you have a reputation that has remained spotless through years of careful consideration. One misstep, and everything you have built will crumble. I am well aware of the complications, Margaret said, but her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Catherine softened. Do you still love him, after everything? The question hung in the air like a question that had no honest answer. I love the possibility of him, Margaret said finally. I love the memory of what we were, but I no longer know if that is the same as loving the man he has become. The snow began to fall on Christmas Eve, soft and relentless, transforming the streets of Boston into something that resembled the watercolor paintings that hung in Margaret's parlor. She had spent the entire day moving between rooms in her home, unable to settle, her fingers finding occupation in needlework, then abandoning it for a book, then setting the book aside to gaze out windows at the world being gradually erased and redrawn by winter. Constance had mentioned, with careful neutrality, that the Duke had sent word of his intended visit at 7:30 in the evening. Margaret had nodded, then immediately second-guessed every decision she had made regarding her appearance. Her dress, her hair, the subtle arrangement of flowers in the parlor. It was ridiculous, this vanity, and yet she could not seem to overcome it. At precisely 7:30, Edward stood in her receiving room, snowflakes clinging to the dark wool of his overcoat like diamonds that were already beginning their inevitable transformation into water. Margaret had not heard him arrive. She had been standing in the library, gathering courage, as one might gather coins before making a significant purchase. When she entered the parlor, he was studying the portrait of her father that hung above the fireplace. A stern-faced man who had passed 15 years prior and would never know the complication of his daughter's heart. "You kept his portrait," Edward said without turning. "I remember you showing me this years ago. You told me he was impossible to please, that he viewed sentiment as weakness." Margaret settled into the chair opposite the sofa, maintaining a careful distance between them. "He would have been appalled by the spectacle of your presence in my home. A married man, unaccompanied, the very thing he feared would destroy his daughter's reputation." Edward turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes held something that resembled pain. "Yet here you have invited me, despite your father's ghost disapproving. That suggests something has changed in you, Margaret. Or perhaps I am simply too hopeful, reading meaning into courtesy that may be nothing more than that." "I invited you," Margaret said carefully, "because we cannot continue existing in this state of half-acknowledgement. You arrive at functions I attend and hover at the periphery of my vision. You send books with carefully selected passages marked. You appear at the library when you know I will be there. This, whatever this is, must be addressed directly, as adults, not as two people dancing around an impossible past." Edward moved to the settee but did not sit. He remained standing, a man caught between the impulse to bridge the distance and the understanding that some gaps cannot be crossed without permission. "I came to ask you to marry me," he said without preamble, without the softening of smaller talk. "I know the complications. I know that I am still technically married, that our union would create scandal from Boston to London. I know that it would damage your reputation, that society will never forgive either of us for choosing love over propriety. But I also know that I have spent 7 years in a state of profound regret, and I cannot spend 7 more. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. All the conversations she had rehearsed, all the careful arguments she had constructed, they scattered like startled birds. "You cannot ask me this," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I can," Edward replied, "and I am. Will you take the risk? Will you come to London with me and we will face whatever follows? I have secured a townhouse in Belgrave Square. I have engaged solicitors to explore every possible avenue of separation from my wife. I cannot promise you a traditional marriage, not immediately, but I can promise you a life built on genuine affection, partnership, and the love that has sustained me through years of absence." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Margaret's hands trembled as he opened it to reveal a sapphire engagement ring, the stone precisely the shade of her eyes on the day he had first fallen in love with her. "This was my mother's," Edward continued. "I have carried it for 7 years, unable to offer it to her, unable to move forward with my own life. I want you to have it, Margaret, not because propriety demands it, but because I love you. Not the memory of who you were, but the woman you have become. The woman who survived my absence, the woman who built a life without me and made it beautiful and meaningful. That woman is more extraordinary than the girl I left behind ever was." Margaret rose from her seat and walked to the window, needing the distance that the physical space could provide. The snow continued to fall, covering everything, erasing boundaries between one thing and another. "If I say yes," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth behind her, "I am not doing so from the romantic impulse that animated my younger self. I have learned too much about the world, about compromise, about the gap between what we desire and what is possible." "I know," Edward said quietly from behind her. "That is precisely why I'm asking. I do not want the girl who believed love could conquer all. That girl could have been destroyed by disappointment. I want the woman who knows that love is harder than fairy tales suggest, and who is willing to choose it anyway." Margaret turned to face him. She could see his reflection in the glass behind her, a man caught between hope and fear, waiting for her answer as though his entire world balanced on her next words. Perhaps it did. Perhaps her world balanced on them as well. "I have questions," Margaret said finally. "Practical questions, not romantic ones. What is your wife's situation? Will she agree to a separation? What will your family say? What of my position here, my home, my investments, the life I have built?" Edward smiled, a real smile, not the theatrical expression of a man performing romance, but the genuine expression of someone relieved that dialogue was becoming possible. "Your solicitor and mine can negotiate the details of your estates. You will retain complete control of your property and investments. I will not have it any other way. My wife has taken a lover, and she will welcome the separation as much as I do. My family will be scandalized, and then they will adjust to reality, as families do. As for your position here, you will maintain it if you wish. You can divide your time between Boston and London, or you can remain here, and I will divide mine. The practical details matter far less to me than the answer to a simpler question." "Which is?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew what he would ask. "Do you love me? Not the memory of me, not the version of me you have imagined in solitude, but me, the flawed man standing before you who made terrible choices and has spent 7 years understanding exactly how terrible they were." Margaret looked at the box he still held, at the sapphire that caught the light of the fire and threw it back in fragments of blue. She thought of the girl she had been, brave and hopeful and willing to believe in miracles. She thought of the woman she had become, cautious, self-protective, afraid. She thought of the space between those two versions of herself, the vast territory of heartbreak and survival and gradual healing that had shaped her into someone new. "Yes," she said finally, "I do love you, but it is not the same love I felt 7 years ago. It is something more complicated, more real. It is love that knows what it costs and chooses to pay the price anyway." Edward crossed the distance between them and took her left hand. He slipped the sapphire onto her finger, and Margaret felt the weight of it, not heavy but present, impossible to ignore. "Then that is the love I will treasure for the rest of my life," he said. "The love that is earned rather than simply given. The love that comes after loss." They did not make immediate plans. Instead, they sat by the fire through the long evening, talking about the practical details that would govern their future. Margaret learned that Edward had already begun the process of securing a separation agreement with his wife, who had been surprisingly amenable. She had her own lover, a man from a respectable family who could not marry her while she remained tied to Edward, but who awaited the dissolution of their union with what Edward described as barely concealed impatience. The separation would be structured carefully, a mutual agreement to live separately, presented to society as the unfortunate conclusion of a union that had never been well suited. It would create talk, but it would not destroy them entirely. "I will not ask you to abandon this life," Edward said, gesturing to the room around them. "Boston is your home. These are your people. You have built something meaningful here." Margaret shook her head. "I built a comfortable life here. But comfort is not the same as meaning. I have spent 7 years living a very small existence, Edward. I have attended the same functions, spoken to the same people, read the same books. I have been safe, but I have not been alive." "Then come to London with me," Edward urged. "Come and be alive with me." But Margaret held up her hand. "Not yet. I need time, and you must understand that. I need to grieve the version of our story that ended 7 years ago. I need to grieve the version I imagined in all the nights I spent alone, waiting for a letter that never came. I need to grieve both of those versions so that I can be present for whatever comes next." Edward looked as though he might argue, but something in her expression stopped him. He nodded slowly. "How long?" he asked. "I do not know," Margaret replied honestly. "Weeks, perhaps, maybe months. But I will not run away from this, from you, any more than I ran toward you all those years ago. This time, I will walk deliberately toward my future, with my eyes open and my heart prepared." The weeks that followed were a curious mixture of anticipation and deliberation. Edward remained in Boston, taking rooms at one of the better hotels and becoming something of a fixture at society events. Always careful to maintain propriety, always attentive to Margaret, but never crossing the boundaries of what could be explained away as the reunion of old friends. Margaret found herself surprised by how readily Boston society accepted his presence. People were far more forgiving than she had anticipated, particularly when it became clear that Edward's intentions were honorable and his affection for her was genuine. Catherine called frequently, ostensibly to discuss the scandal that was brewing, but more often to offer genuine counsel. "You know that accepting him means accepting a life of complications," Catherine said one afternoon in late January. "Society will never quite forgive either of you for the affair, and it will be considered an affair, regardless of the technicalities of his separation." "I know," Margaret replied. "But Catherine, I have spent 7 years living a life that society would approve of. I have been irreproachable, I have been proper, and what has it earned me? Loneliness, safety, yes, but at the cost of my own happiness." Catherine reached over and squeezed her friend's hand. "Then I'm glad you are choosing differently. Life is too short to sacrifice it on the altar of other people's expectations." In mid-February, Margaret received a letter from Edward's solicitor. The separation agreement had been finalized. His wife had taken a settlement and would retire to the country estates, away from London society's scrutiny. The documents were waiting for Edward's signature. They would be finalized by spring. When Edward showed her the letter, his expression was neither triumphant nor relieved, but simply accepting. "This is real now," he said. "There is no going back, regardless of what either of us decides." Margaret looked at the letter, at the legal language that translated 7 years of heartbreak into formal paragraphs and carefully worded clauses. "I need to make a decision," she said. Over the following week, Margaret made preparations. She arranged for Constance to remain in Boston, managing her household and her investments. She wrote to several organizations to which she had contributed over the years, explaining that she would be relocating to London. She visited the graves of her parents and stood there in the winter cold, speaking to them as though they could hear her. "I am going to be happy," she told the stones. "I'm going to go to London, and I am going to be with Edward, and I am going to stop apologizing for it. You raised me to be honorable, to value reputation and propriety. But you also taught me to be true to myself, and I believe that if you were here, you would understand that sometimes being true to yourself means defying what the world expects." On the morning of her departure, Margaret stood on the dock in Boston Harbor, watching the ship that would carry her across the Atlantic being prepared for departure. Edward stood beside her, his hand finding hers as naturally as if they had been doing this for years, instead of being reunited for only a few months. "Are you certain?" he asked, though the question seemed rhetorical at this point. "No," Margaret said honestly. "I am terrified, actually. But I am also certain that I have been waiting for 7 years, and I have finished waiting. I am ready to live again." As the ship pulled away from the dock, Margaret stood at the railing and watched Boston gradually recede into the distance. She thought of the girl she had been, who had believed love could overcome any obstacle. She thought of the woman who had survived 7 years of heartbreak and built a life of quiet contentment. And she thought of the woman she was becoming, one who understood that love is neither simple nor uncomplicated, but who was willing to choose it anyway. 3 months later, in a small ceremony attended by select members of both their families, Margaret and Edward married in a chapel in Belgrave Square. They did not seek the approval of London society. Society would approve or disapprove as it saw fit. Instead, they stood before witnesses and made vows to each other, not promises of fairy tale happiness, but promises of partnership, of commitment, of choosing each other day after day in the real and complicated world. The morning after their wedding, Edward found Margaret in the breakfast room of their townhouse, gazing out at the London skyline. He came up behind her and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Margaret turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of the girl he had once loved and the woman she had become, integrated now, no longer fragmented by loss. "I am," she said. "Not in the way I imagined happiness would feel when I was 24 years old, but in a way that feels more real, more earned, more true. I am happy, Edward, and I am not afraid to be." He kissed her then, and it was not a theatrical gesture or a moment designed for observers. It was simply the kiss of two people who had lived separate lives, who had survived separate griefs, and who had found each other again on the other side of those experiences. They had not recovered the past, nor had they tried to. Instead, they had created something new, a future built on the foundation of heartbreak, tempered by the wisdom of time, and strengthened by the deliberate choice to try again. The love story that had broken 7 years ago had not been restored. Rather, it had been transformed into something stronger, something that had been forged in the fires of loss and absence, and had emerged as something capable of enduring. And as they stood together in the morning light of their new life, Margaret realized that perhaps this was the only kind of love story that truly mattered. Not the one that had never been broken, but the one that had been broken and, against all odds and despite all complications, had learned to heal.